The Golden Plains breathed under the merciless midday heat. Summer had punished the region for weeks, transforming what was once a carpet of lush vegetation into a mosaic of yellows and browns. The sky, almost painfully blue, showed no clouds that might promise relief to the thirsty land. In a small valley between two hills of dried grass, a young Palomino foal lay motionless. His name was Spirit, though no human had yet given him that designation. Born just 3 weeks earlier, during the last rains that had visited the plains, he now struggled to breathe. His delicate legs, designed to one day run with the speed of wind, could barely move. His large, expressive eyes watched the horizon with a mixture of confusion and resignation. A sudden storm had scattered the herd the night before. Amid the chaos of lightning and howling winds, Spirit had become separated from his mother. Too young to find water on his own, and inexperienced in protecting himself from the dangers of the savannah, the foal had wandered until his strength was exhausted under the merciless sun. A few yards away, partially hidden by the sparse shade of a twisted acacia, two attentive eyes watched. They were amber eyes, deep as ancient wells belonging to Atlas, an elderly lion whose body told stories of battles and survival. His mane, once exuberant and golden, now showed grey streaks and thinning patches that testified to the passage of time. He walked slowly, with the dignity of one who once ruled these lands, but also with the caution of one who knew his current limitations. Atlas had caught the scent of fragile life carried by the wind. It was the primitive instinct that guided him, the promise of a meal that wouldn't require the effort of a true hunt. His muscles, tired from years of use, would appreciate it. He approached with the silent fluidity characteristic of his species, each step calculated, each movement economical. When he came close enough to clearly observe the fallen foal, something unexpected happened. Spirit, gathering strength that seemed non-existent, slightly raised his head. His eyes, blurred by dehydration, met those of the lion. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and prey stared at each other, not with the usual terror and ferocity of such an encounter, but with a strange mutual understanding. Atlas stopped. A gentle breeze passed between them, carrying the scent of warm earth and dry grass. The lion sat on his hindquarters, his tail moving slowly from side to side as he continued to observe the foal with disconcerting intensity. There was something about this young one that awakened old memories in Atlas, perhaps reminiscences of his own cubs, lost years ago to human hunters, or perhaps just the recognition of the fragility he himself was beginning to feel in his aging body. Beside the foal there was a small depression where the last rain had formed a nearly depleted water puddle. The dried mud around it indicated that, until a few days ago, this had been a hydration point for animals in the region. Now only a few centimeters of murky liquid remained, protected from complete evaporation by the partial shadow of a rock. Atlas turned his gaze to the puddle, then back to the foal. In his experienced eyes was the precise calculation of one who had lived decades in the plains. The foal would not survive without water. It wasn't a question of if, but when he would succumb to heat and dehydration. With deliberately slow movements, the lion rose and walked to the small puddle. He lowered himself, wet his muzzle in the warm water, and returned to the foal. To any observer, the following scene would defy all known natural laws. Atlas gently touched his wet muzzle against Spirit's dry lips, once, twice, 3 times, moistening them with small drops that seemed like the most precious offerings in that arid scenario. The foal, instinctively, ran his tongue over his moistened lips. A subtle tremor ran through his thin body, the sensation of water, however insignificant, awakening a last flicker of will to live. His eyes, previously cloudy, seemed to clear slightly, fixing with new intensity on the face of the predator who, for some inexplicable reason, had become his unlikely savior. In the distance, at the top of one of the hills surrounding the small valley, a pair of binoculars captured the extraordinary scene. Dr. Sarah Wilson, a biologist from the Golden Plains Nature Reserve, could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Beside her, Mark Thompson, a veterinarian from the same institution, had stopped mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open in silent astonishment. "In 20 years studying animal behavior, I've never seen anything remotely like this," whispered Sarah, not taking her eyes off the scene. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, casting shadows that gradually lengthened across the dry terrain. In the small valley, predator and prey remained in a proximity that defied all natural logic, united by something that transcended the roles established by the cycle of wildlife, something that, in the days to come, would transform not only their individual existences, but human understanding of the unlikely bonds that can form in the most unexpected circumstances. Sarah and Mark remained motionless atop the hill, divided between scientific fascination and professional responsibility. As biologists dedicated to conservation, their protocol was clear: observe without interfering in the natural course of events. Nature, as cruel as it might seem to human eyes, had its own wisdom. But what they were witnessing didn't fit any known behavioral pattern. It was a singular event that defied decades of studies on predator-prey interactions. Should we intervene? Mark finally asked, lowering his binoculars. His face, tanned by the tropical sun, showed lines of concern. The foal clearly won't survive without medical assistance, even with whatever this lion is doing. Sarah bit her lip, a habit that emerged whenever she faced ethical dilemmas in the field. Her fingers nervously tapped on the photographic equipment she carried. If we intervene now, we might put both at risk, she answered after a long pause. The lion might feel threatened and attack the foal or us. Besides, we've seen situations where our well-intentioned interference caused more harm than good. The sun was beginning to decline on the horizon, painting the sky with orange tones that reflected on the golden coat of the old lion. In the valley below, Atlas had lain down beside the foal, maintaining a certain distance, but close enough that his presence was unequivocal. From time to time, he would get up, go to the small water puddle, and repeat the gesture of moistening the foal's lips. It was as if, in some incomprehensible way, he had taken on the responsibility for the small animal's welfare. "Look at that," whispered Mark, pointing to a dark patch moving in the tall grass, about 200 yards from the unlikely pair. Hyenas. Sarah quickly adjusted her binoculars. 3 hyenas circled at a distance, certainly attracted by the smell of vulnerability. Opportunistic animals by nature, they represented a real threat to the debilitated foal, and potentially even to the elderly lion, if they decided to attack as a group. It was at that moment that the decision crystallized. It was no longer a question of scientific observation, but of necessary intervention in exceptional circumstances. "Let's go down," Sarah decided, storing her equipment in her backpack with quick, precise movements. Not to separate the lion from the foal, but to drive away the hyenas and provide water and basic assistance. If the lion reacts negatively to our presence, we'll back off. But we can't simply watch while those hyenas approach. Mark nodded, his serious expression revealing that he understood both the risks and the necessity of action. He checked the emergency veterinary kit they always carried on expeditions. There were antibiotics, rehydration solutions, some basic bandages. It wasn't ideal for complete treatment, but it could make the difference between life and death for the foal. With maximum caution, the 2 researchers began descending the hill, choosing a path that would keep them visible at all times, avoiding any approach that might be interpreted as an ambush by the lion. They communicated through gestures and whispers, each movement calculated to cause minimal disturbance. As they approached, they could observe details that distance had hidden. The foal was in even worse condition than they had imagined. His ribs were visible under the skin, and small tremors periodically ran through his body. The lion, in turn, displayed old scars all over his body and a slight limp in his right hind leg, signs of a long and challenging life on the plains. About 50 yards from the pair, Sarah signaled for Mark to stop. Slowly, she removed a metal canteen and a small collapsible silicone basin from her backpack. With deliberately slow movements, she poured water into the basin and placed it on the ground in front of her. Then she took 3 steps back, creating distance. Atlas had noticed their approach from the beginning. His amber eyes followed each movement with the attention characteristic of an experienced predator. When Sarah placed the water on the ground, his ears moved forward, showing interest. Still, he didn't move away from the foal, as if afraid that his momentary absence might leave the young one vulnerable. "He's protecting the foal," murmured Mark, incredulity evident in his voice. "Not just refraining from hunting it, but actively protecting it." Sarah nodded silently, equally amazed by the behavioral complexity they were witnessing. For years, they had documented isolated cases of altruistic behaviors between different species. Dolphins protecting humans from sharks, elephants helping other animals stuck in mud. but nothing comparable to the scene that now unfolded before them. An apex predator protecting a species that, under normal circumstances, would be its prey. The hyenas, sensing the human presence, had retreated to a safe distance but remained visible, watching with the characteristic patience of those who know how to wait for the right moment. For almost an hour, the biologists remained motionless, respecting the space of the unlikely pair. Eventually, the need for water spoke louder than caution, and Atlas rose. With impressive dignity, the old lion slowly walked to the basin offered by the humans. He sniffed it carefully, tested the water with his tongue, and apparently satisfied with its quality, began to drink with controlled eagerness. When he finished, instead of immediately returning to the foal, Atlas did something that left the researchers perplexed. He looked directly at Sarah, then at the water basin and again at the fallen foal, as if trying to communicate a need. "He wants water for the foal," said Sarah, the sudden understanding making her voice falter. "Mark, I think he's asking for our help." The connection between the old predator and the humans had been established at that moment, fragile as the first thread of a web, but with the potential to strengthen. The sun was already disappearing on the horizon when the biologists, moving with extreme care, managed to get close enough to offer water to the weakened foal. Under the watchful eye of Atlas, who didn't move away at any moment, they administered small amounts of liquid and assessed the young one's condition. The preliminary diagnosis was serious: severe dehydration, possible beginning of pulmonary infection, generalized weakness. Without complete medical intervention, his chances were minimal. Night fell over the Golden Plains, bringing with it the promise of new challenges. Sarah and Mark set up a small improvised camp at a respectful distance, keeping low-intensity lanterns lit to deter opportunistic predators. A few yards away, illuminated by the crescent moon, the lion remained as a silent sentinel beside the foal, whose breathing now seemed slightly more stable. "What do we do at dawn?" asked Mark, as they observed the extraordinary scene. "We bring reinforcements," Sarah replied with determination. "Proper equipment. Transport to the rehabilitation center. We're going to save them both." "Both?" "Yes," she confirmed, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Something tells me that trying to separate these two would be a mistake. I can't explain scientifically what's happening here, but I know when we're facing something exceptional that deserves to be preserved." In the silence of the African night, under a sky dotted with countless stars, an unlikely alliance between species was consolidating, a silent testimony that at times compassion transcends barriers we believed insurmountable. And two humans, trained to observe without interfering, were now becoming active parts of a story that defied everything they had learned about the limits of animal behavior. The first light of morning found Sarah already awake, finalizing communication via radio with the reserve headquarters. During the night, she had developed a detailed plan, anticipating every possible contingency for the rescue of the two animals. Mark, who had monitored the foal and the lion in alternating shifts with his colleague, prepared an improvised electrolytic solution with the limited supplies they carried. "They're sending the complete team," Sarah informed, turning off the radio. "Special truck for transporting large felines, veterinary team, appropriate tranquilizers for both. They'll arrive in approximately 3 hours." Mark nodded, his gaze fixed on the unlikely pair a few yards away. During the night, Atlas's behavior had become even more intriguing. The lion had not only remained beside the foal, but occasionally licked his neck and face with surprising gentleness, a behavior typically reserved for cubs of his own species. The foal, in turn, seemed to respond positively to the predator's presence, showing fewer signs of stress than would be expected. "I managed to document everything," commented Mark, indicating the small camera mounted on an improvised tripod. "No one would believe it without visual evidence." The sun rose slowly on the horizon, warming the still, cool morning air. Sarah used the better light to examine the surroundings with her binoculars, confirming that the hyenas had moved away, although they were probably still in the region. A few yards away, a small herd of gazelles grazed peacefully, apparently indifferent to the lion's presence, a silent testimony that somehow they perceived that the old predator posed no immediate threat. "We need to approach again," said Sarah, preparing a new basin with fresh water. "The foal needs more hydration before the team arrives." With the same caution as the day before, the two researchers approached the unlikely pair. Atlas raised his head, watching them attentively but without showing aggression. His behavior seemed almost expectant, as if he understood that the humans represented help, not threat. When they were about 15 feet away, something extraordinary happened. The lion deliberately backed up a few steps, creating space for them to approach the foal. He remained alert, every muscle in his body visibly tense, but there was an expression in his eyes that seemed to communicate permission. "Unbelievable," whispered Mark as they cautiously advanced. Working with efficiency born of years of field experience, the biologists administered water and an energy solution to the debilitated foal. His condition had stabilized during the night, but he was still far from being out of danger. The dehydration had caused damage that would need prolonged treatment to completely reverse. As they worked, they spoke in low, soft voices, not only to calm the foal, but also to keep Atlas informed of their presence and movements. It was a peculiar dialogue, humans talking to a predator as if he could understand every word, and the feline responding with an attention that seemed to confirm this understanding. "We're here to help," said Sarah, addressing the lion directly while Mark carefully examined the foal. "Both of you need care that we can't provide here." As if responding to the explanation, Atlas sat on his hind legs, his posture emanating a dignity that contrasted with the scars and age marks on his body. His gaze alternated between the foal and the humans, vigilant but not hostile. The rumble of engines in the distance announced the early arrival of the rescue team. Sarah signaled for them to approach slowly, without sirens or sudden movements. The truck, specially equipped for transporting wild animals, parked at a respectful distance, and 4 people descended with deliberately slow movements. Dr. Jessica Torres, the reserve's chief veterinarian, approached first, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the unusual situation. Behind her, 2 handlers carried containment equipment and a special stretcher for the foal. "Most extraordinary situation of my career," commented Jessica in a low voice, observing the lion who watched the movement with concentrated attention. "How do you suggest we proceed?" "Simultaneous sedation," Sarah replied without hesitation. "If we sedate one first, the other might panic or become aggressive. We need to do this in a coordinated way." The plan was quickly outlined. 2 teams would work in parallel, one responsible for the foal, the other for the lion. They would use tranquilizer darts fired at short distance, ensuring maximum precision and exact dosage for each animal. Timing was crucial. The darts would need to be fired almost simultaneously. While the team prepared the equipment, Sarah approached Atlas again. Crouching at a safe distance, she looked directly into the old lion's eyes. "I don't know if you understand, but we're trying to help," she said in a low voice. "We're going to take you both to a place where you can recover. Together." It was impossible to know how much of her communication the animal truly understood, but there was a depth in his amber eyes that suggested more understanding than any scientific manual would consider possible. For a brief moment, Sarah had the disconcerting impression of being before not just a predator guided by instincts, but a complex consciousness, capable of decisions that transcended mere survival. The teams positioned themselves. The darts were prepared with carefully calculated doses, sufficient to sedate, but not to cause unnecessary risks. At Jessica's signal, the shooters acted in perfect synchrony. Atlas felt the sting in his flank and turned quickly, a low growl escaping his throat. For a tense moment it seemed he might attack, but his gaze met Sarah's again, and something in that connection seemed to calm him. With impressive dignity, the old lion turned to the foal as if wanting to check on his condition one last time before the sedation took effect. Minutes later, both animals were unconscious. The teams worked quickly and efficiently, transferring them to the specialized vehicle. The foal was placed on a padded stretcher, equipped with vital sign monitors. The lion, restrained with additional safety precautions, was positioned in a separate but adjacent compartment. "Physical separations, but not visual," Sarah had insisted. "When they wake up, they need to be able to see each other." The journey back to the reserve proceeded without incident. Every half hour, the veterinary team checked the vital signs of both animals, adjusting intravenous medication and ensuring they remained stable. The foal, who had received the provisional name Spirit for his will to live, was responding well to rehydration and initial antibiotics. The lion, now officially called Atlas, bearer of burdens, remained in stable condition, although preliminary examinations confirmed what observation had already indicated: advanced age, arthritis in the hind joints, compromised dentition. When they finally arrived at the reserve's rehabilitation center, a special facility had already been prepared following Sarah's detailed instructions. Two adjacent enclosures, separated by reinforced transparent barriers, would allow the animals to maintain visual contact while receiving separate treatments appropriate for each species. News of the extraordinary pair had spread quickly, and a small crowd of staff and researchers awaited their arrival. The respectful silence that fell when the truck parked demonstrated the collective understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented, an example of connection between species that defied all expectations. "It's more than interspecific altruistic behavior," commented Dr. Michael Chen, the reserve's director, as he observed the careful transfer of the animals to the facility. "It's almost as if there was a communication we don't understand happening between them." Sarah, exhausted but satisfied with the success of the rescue, just nodded. The next few hours would be critical, the moment when the animals would awaken from sedation and perceive their new environment. No one could predict how they would react if the connection observed in the plains would persist in this new context. "I'll monitor them personally," she declared, gently rejecting suggestions that she rest. "I need to be present when they wake up." The sun was beginning its decline on the horizon when the first signs of awakening manifested. First the foal, then the lion, gradually emerged from sedation. The critical moment had arrived. The observation room was silent, illuminated only by the dim light of monitors displaying the vital signs of Spirit and Atlas. Sarah, seated in an uncomfortable chair for more than 4 hours, leaned forward with absolute attention. Beside her, Jessica constantly checked the medical data, while Mark documented each movement with a camera specialized in low-light filming. "Eye movement in Spirit," announced Jessica quietly. "He's beginning to wake up." The young foal was the first to show clear signs of consciousness. His eyelids trembled, his ears moved in response to ambient sounds, and he finally tried to raise his head. He was considerably stronger after intravenous rehydration and initial treatments, but still showed the weakness of one who had been on the brink of death. "Elevated heart rate," continued the veterinarian, observing the monitors, "within expectations for the stress of waking in a new environment." Sarah nodded without taking her eyes off the enclosure. The crucial moment was approaching. How would the foal react upon fully awakening and perceiving himself in a strange environment, surrounded by unfamiliar scents? More importantly, how would he react to the close presence of the lion, now that he was no longer debilitated by dehydration and had enough energy to feel fear? Spirit finally managed to stand up, still unstable on his slender legs. His head turned slowly, large eyes absorbing the new environment with the curiosity characteristic of the young. When he noticed the barriers surrounding him, his muscles visibly tensed and a low whinny escaped his throat, the first sound the researchers had heard him make. In the adjacent enclosure, that sound provoked an immediate reaction. Atlas, who until then had seemed still semi-conscious, opened his eyes completely. With an effort that evidenced his age and physical condition, the old lion rose to his feet. Despite the arthritis that clearly bothered him, he managed to stand, his gaze immediately fixing on the source of the sound. "Here we go," whispered Mark, adjusting the camera's focus to capture the exact moment of the visual reunion. The impact was impressive in its subtlety. When the gazes of Spirit and Atlas finally met through the transparent barrier, there was a visible transformation in both. The foal's heart rate, which had elevated with anxiety, began to stabilize. His posture, previously tense and defensive, gradually relaxed. The lion in turn emitted a low, deep sound, not a roar or growl, but something closer to a deep sigh. His eyes, which had quickly scanned the environment for potential threats, now remained fixed on the young equine with an almost palpable intensity. "It's incredible," murmured Jessica, observing the monitors. "The physiological indicators of both are stabilizing in each other's presence. It's as if they comfort each other." During the following hours, the team observed with growing fascination the interaction between the two animals. Although physically separated, they maintained a silent communication through gazes, subtle movements, and occasional vocalizations. When the veterinary team needed to enter to administer medications or perform examinations, it became evident that each animal accepted the interventions better when they could visualize the other during the procedure. "We are witnessing something that could revolutionize our understanding of cognition and emotions in wild animals," commented Dr. Chen, who had joined the observation group the following morning. "The question is, How do we proceed from here? It was a question with profound implications. The standard protocol would be clear. Treat the foal until his complete recovery and then reintegrate him into a wild herd. As for the lion, considering his advanced age and compromised physical condition, he would probably be kept under permanent care at the reserve, unable to survive alone in nature. Separating the two would be the logical procedure, based on decades of conservationist practices. But the situation they faced transcended established protocols. The bond between Atlas and Spirit wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it seemed fundamental to the well-being of both. In the weeks that followed, as Spirit gained strength and Atlas received treatments to alleviate his arthritic pains, the reserve team meticulously documented every aspect of this extraordinary relationship. "We have to think beyond conventional categories," suggested Sarah, during one of the many meetings held to discuss the case. "Perhaps we need a specially designed enclosure where they can physically interact under supervision. What we're observing challenges everything we thought we knew about interspecies relationships." Dr. Chen, initially skeptical about the risks of allowing direct contact between a predator and what would naturally be its prey, gradually came to recognize the unique nature of the situation. The team designed a series of controlled interactions, first through a mesh fence, then with closely supervised direct contact. The results exceeded all expectations. When finally allowed in the same space, Atlas and Spirit demonstrated a level of mutual trust that defied conventional understanding. The lion, despite his carnivorous nature, showed no predatory behavior whatsoever toward the foal. Instead, he assumed a protective posture, always positioning himself between the young horse and any perceived threat, including when reserve staff approached. Spirit, in turn, exhibited none of the innate fear that equines typically show toward large felines. He would often rest beside Atlas, sometimes even nuzzling against the lion's mane in a display of affection that left even the most experienced animal behaviorists speechless. "We need to share this with the world," Dr. Chen finally decided, after weeks of observation and documentation. With proper context and scientific rigor, this case study could fundamentally change how we understand animal cognition and emotional capacity. With careful consideration for the well-being of both animals, the reserve developed a special area where visitors could observe the extraordinary pair from a distance that wouldn't cause stress. Educational programs were developed around their story, highlighting themes of compassion, adaptation, and the complexity of animal consciousness. As months passed, Spirit grew into a strong young horse, his golden coat gleaming with health. Atlas, though still showing signs of his advanced age, responded well to treatments for his arthritis and dental issues. The most remarkable aspect, however, was how their relationship evolved, from the initial protective dynamic to something resembling genuine companionship. "It transcends instinct," Sarah often explained to visiting researchers. "What we're observing is a conscious choice to override hardwired biological programming in favor of something else, something we might cautiously term as friendship." The scientific papers published about Atlas and Spirit sparked debates worldwide. Some researchers remained skeptical, attributing the behavior to aberrations caused by extreme circumstances. Others saw it as evidence supporting expanding theories about animal consciousness and emotional complexity. For Sarah, Mark, and the team who had witnessed the relationship from its extraordinary beginning, the academic debates, while important, were secondary to the daily reality they observed. Two beings from entirely different worlds, finding in each other something that transcended the natural order. A connection based not on necessity or instinct, but on what could only be described as mutual recognition of another conscious being. As the first anniversary of Atlas and Spirit's rescue approached, the Golden Plains Reserve found itself transformed. What had begun as a standard conservation facility had evolved into something more ambitious, a pioneering research center focused on interspecies relationships and animal cognition. Dr. Chen stood at the window of his office, watching visitors gather at the observation platform, overlooking the special enclosure where the lion and horse had lived together for nearly a year. What had initially been considered a temporary arrangement had proven to be the only viable option for both animals' well-being. Attempts to introduce Spirit to other equines had resulted in the young horse becoming visibly distressed and repeatedly trying to return to Atlas. "The funding approval came through," announced Sarah, entering the office with a tablet displaying the email she'd just received. Her expression was one of barely contained excitement. The Sanctuary project has been greenlit, full funding for the next 5 years. Michael Chen turned from the window, a broad smile spreading across his usually serious face. That's fantastic news. I knew our proposal was strong, but with competition for conservation grants being so fierce these days, the review committee specifically cited the Atlas Spirit case study as compelling evidence for the need to reconsider traditional approaches to wildlife rehabilitation, Sarah read from the email. They're calling it a paradigm-shifting opportunity. The Sanctuary project represented the culmination of months of planning and countless hours of debate among conservationists, ethologists, and animal welfare experts. Its premise was both simple and revolutionary, creating a facility designed specifically for animals that, for various reasons, had formed bonds across species lines, bonds that would make traditional rehabilitation or release programs detrimental to their welfare. "We should tell the team right away," said Michael, already reaching for his phone. Jessica and Mark have been checking their emails every 5 minutes for the past week. Within the hour, the core team had gathered in the conference room, where champagne, a rare indulgence at the typically austere research facility, was being poured into paper cups. The atmosphere was one of celebration tinged with the solemnity of responsibility. They were about to embark on something unprecedented. "To the Sanctuary project," toasted Michael, raising his cup, "and to Atlas and Spirit, who showed us that sometimes the animals know better than we do." The following months were a whirlwind of activity. Architects specializing in wildlife habitats worked alongside animal behaviorists to design a facility that would accommodate diverse species with varying needs while allowing for safe interaction between bonded pairs. Construction began on an expansive tract of land adjacent to the existing reserve, carefully selected to provide a variety of natural environments while remaining accessible for research and educational purposes. As the project progressed, something unexpected happened. Similar cases began to emerge from other conservation facilities around the world. A rehabilitated elephant that had formed a bond with a water buffalo in Thailand, a wolf and a deer that coexisted peacefully at a wildlife rescue in Canada, a dolphin that had adopted an orphaned harbor porpoise in a marine sanctuary off the coast of New Zealand. "It's as if Atlas and Spirit gave people permission to see what was always there," remarked Sarah one evening, as she updated the project's growing database of documented interspecies relationships. "These connections have probably been happening all along, but were dismissed as anomalies or not reported because they didn't fit our understanding." The scientific community remained divided. Traditional conservationists argued that encouraging such unnatural bonds might compromise the integrity of rehabilitation efforts and ultimately harm wildlife populations. Others, particularly those in the emerging field of cognitive ethology, saw these relationships as valuable windows into animal consciousness and emotional capacity. Throughout the debates and construction challenges, Atlas and Spirit remained the heart of the project. Their daily interactions were documented with scientific rigor, generating data that would form the foundation of numerous papers and studies. Yet beyond the scientific value, there was something about their story that resonated on a deeply human level. Something about overcoming differences, about compassion transcending instinct, about connection in unlikely places. Visitors to the reserve often left the observation area with tears in their eyes, moved by the sight of the majestic lion and the now fully grown horse moving together through their shared habitat, their mutual awareness and care for each other, evident in 100 small gestures. "It reminds us of what's possible," Sarah often told tour groups. "If a lion and a horse can transcend their natural roles to form this kind of bond, what might be possible for the rest of us?" As winter gave way to spring and the sanctuary neared completion, a new challenge emerged. Atlas, now estimated to be in his late teens, extremely elderly for a wild lion, began showing signs of declining health. Despite the best veterinary care, his age-related conditions were progressing. He moved more slowly, slept more hours of the day, and occasionally seemed disoriented. Spirit's response to his companion's decline was remarkable. The young horse, now in his prime, adapted his behavior, slowing his pace to match the lion's, remaining closer than usual, often standing protectively near Atlas when he rested. During one particularly concerning episode when Atlas seemed unable to rise after a nap, Spirit's distressed whinnying alerted the staff before the monitoring systems had detected any issue. "We need to prepare for the inevitable," Jessica said gently during a team meeting after presenting Atlas's latest health assessments. "He's receiving the best care possible, but he's reaching the natural end of a lion's lifespan." The question that hung unspoken in the room was one none of them had an answer for. What would happen to Spirit when Atlas was gone? Would the horse that had defied natural instinct to bond with a predator be able to adjust to that predator's absence? Or would the loss of his unusual companion leave psychological wounds too deep to heal? "We should introduce potential new companions gradually," suggested Mark. "Not as replacements, but as additional social connections. Perhaps another elderly lion who needs companionship but isn't strong enough to pose a threat. Or even other species. Spirit has already proven he doesn't follow the typical equine social template." The team agreed to proceed cautiously, prioritizing both animals' well-being above all else. As they concluded the meeting, Sarah remained behind, looking through the observation window at the pair resting together in the afternoon sun, the golden horse standing vigilant, while the aging lion slept peacefully beside him. "We think we understand the natural world," she murmured to herself. "We categorize, analyze, and explain. But then something like this happens, and we realize how much we still have to learn." As spring blossomed into summer, the Sanctuary project neared completion, promising a new chapter, not just for Atlas and Spirit, but for the understanding of animal relationships worldwide. The unlikely bond that had begun on the parched plains had grown into something that would leave a lasting impact on conservation, research, and perhaps most importantly, on how humans perceived the emotional lives of the creatures with whom they shared the planet. The grand opening of the Wildlife Bond Sanctuary drew more attention than anyone at the Golden Plains Reserve had anticipated. What had been planned as a modest ceremony, attended primarily by the scientific community and key donors, had transformed into a media event that attracted journalists from major networks, conservation celebrities, and even a few Hollywood stars whose foundations had contributed to the final phases of funding. "I didn't sign up for this circus," grumbled Dr. Chen, adjusting his tie in the reflection of his office window. Outside, staff members were guiding a growing crowd toward the seating area set up near the sanctuary's main entrance. "I'm a researcher, not a public speaker." Sarah smiled sympathetically. "Think of it as an educational opportunity. The more attention Atlas and Spirit receive, the more funding we secure for other projects." She handed him index cards with bullet points for his speech. "Besides, you only have to speak for 5 minutes. Then the documentary team takes over with their preview screening." The documentary in question, titled Boundaries of Nature, was a 1-hour special that had been in production for the past 3 months, chronicling the extraordinary relationship between Atlas and Spirit and the development of the sanctuary it had inspired. Advanced screenings for critics had generated enthusiastic reviews, with several major publications calling it a profound meditation on the complexity of animal relationships and a challenge to our understanding of natural boundaries. As the ceremony began, Sarah found herself scanning the gathered crowd from her position at the side of the stage. Scientists she'd cited in papers sat alongside celebrities she'd seen only on magazine covers, all drawn by the same unlikely story. The power of that story struck her anew, how a moment of compassion between natural enemies had rippled outward, touching countless lives and challenging fundamental assumptions about the animal world. Dr. Chen's speech, despite his nervousness, was received with enthusiastic applause. He spoke not just about Atlas and Spirit, but about the dozen other interspecies pairs that had already been identified as potential residents for the new sanctuary. "What we're witnessing isn't merely anomalous behavior," he concluded, his scientific reserve giving way to genuine passion. "It's a window into the emotional and cognitive capabilities that exist throughout the animal kingdom, capabilities that we've often overlooked or dismissed because they didn't fit our preconceptions." The documentary screening that followed moved many in the audience to tears, particularly the carefully captured footage of Atlas's most recent health crisis and Spirit's evident distress and protective behavior. The film concluded with sweeping aerial shots of the newly completed sanctuary, a 200-acre complex featuring carefully designed habitats that could be connected or separated as needed, state-of-the-art veterinary facilities, and observation areas that would allow for research and limited educational viewing without disturbing the animals. As the credits rolled and the lights came up, a spontaneous standing ovation filled the tent. Sarah felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to find Jessica, the veterinarian, looking uncharacteristically excited. "You need to come right away," she whispered urgently. "Something's happening with Atlas and Spirit." With a quick excuse to Dr. Chen, Sarah followed Jessica through a back exit and down the service path that led to the special habitat where the pair had been temporarily relocated during the opening ceremonies. As they approached, Sarah could hear an unusual sound, a deep rumbling vocalization she'd never heard Atlas make before. They reached the observation blind to find Mark already there, camera in hand, his expression one of amazed disbelief. "What's happening?" Sarah asked breathlessly. "See for yourself," Mark replied, gesturing toward the viewpoint. In the spacious enclosure, Atlas stood more upright than he had in weeks, his posture almost youthful despite his advanced age. Beside him, Spirit moved in what almost appeared to be a synchronized pattern, walking a few steps, pausing, then circling back. The two animals were engaged in what looked remarkably like play behavior, something the researchers had documented only rarely between them, and never with this level of vigor from the elderly lion. "His blood work this morning showed improvement," Jessica said quietly. "The new treatment protocol seems to be having an effect. But this is beyond what the medication could explain." They watched in silent wonder as the unlikely pair continued their interaction. When Atlas finally tired and settled onto a grassy knoll, Spirit stood beside him, occasionally lowering his head to gently nuzzle the lion's mane. There was something so tender in the gesture that it transcended scientific observation. It was simply one being expressing care for another. "We should document this for the longitudinal study," Mark eventually said, though he made no move to leave the viewpoint. "Yes," agreed Sarah, equally transfixed, "but let's just watch for a moment longer." The official transition to the new sanctuary facilities took place 2 days after the opening ceremony. The move was planned with meticulous care to minimize stress for all the animals, with Atlas and Spirit's transfer scheduled for the early morning hours when both would be most calm. To everyone's relief, the process went smoothly. The pair accepted the transport crates with minimal resistance, especially when designed to allow them to maintain visual contact throughout the journey. Over the following weeks, the sanctuary received its first new residents, a blind black bear and the stray dog that had become his guide at a wildlife rehabilitation center in Montana, a pair of orphaned animals, a young moose and a yearling bison, who had bonded during bottle feeding at a rescue facility in Wyoming, and most surprisingly, a small troop of capuchin monkeys who had adopted an abandoned margay kitten, integrating the small wild cat completely into their social structure. When released into their new habitat, a spacious area featuring both open grassland and shaded retreats, they explored together, Spirit occasionally trotting ahead, but always returning to check on his slower companion. Each new arrival brought its own challenges and revelations. The sanctuary team, led by Sarah and expanded to include specialists in various species, developed individualized care plans that respected the unique bonds while ensuring proper healthcare and enrichment for each animal. Public access to the sanctuary was strictly limited, with viewing possible only through carefully positioned observation blinds that didn't disturb the animals. However, the research team developed an extensive online presence, sharing regular updates, educational content, and carefully selected footage that allowed people worldwide to follow the extraordinary relationships unfolding within the sanctuary. "It's changing how people think," Sarah remarked during a team meeting 6 months after the opening. "We're receiving messages from educators who are using our materials to teach children about empathy across differences. Zoos are reconsidering some of their housing protocols based on our observations. Even traditional conservation organizations that were initially skeptical are starting to incorporate our findings into their approaches." As the sanctuary's first year of operation drew to a close, the team faced the bittersweet reality they had been preparing for since the beginning. Atlas, despite periods of remarkable vigor and the best veterinary care available, was approaching the end of his life. At an estimated 18 years of age, extraordinarily old for a wild lion, his health had begun a final decline that no treatment could reverse. The team implemented the protocol they had thoughtfully developed for this inevitable moment. Other animals that Spirit had shown positive interactions with were gradually given more shared time with the pair. The sanctuary's resident animal behaviorist worked closely with Spirit, monitoring for signs of distress and developing strategies to support him through the coming transition. When the day finally came, it was peaceful. Atlas, comfortable on his favorite sunning rock with Spirit standing nearby, simply closed his eyes one last time. The veterinary team, monitoring remotely through unobtrusive sensors, confirmed what the behavioral observers could see. The great lion's heart had stopped. What followed was something none of them, despite all their preparations, had fully anticipated. Spirit remained beside Atlas's body, occasionally nudging him gently, then standing in an almost ceremonial stillness. When the veterinary team finally approached to remove Atlas's body, the horse stepped aside, but followed the procession to the edge of the habitat, watching as they departed. In the difficult days that followed, Spirit's behavior became the focus of intense observation and concern. He showed clear signs of what could only be described as grief, decreased appetite, altered sleep patterns, and a tendency to return to places he had frequently shared with Atlas. Yet there were also signs of resilience, moments of interaction with other sanctuary residents, gradual resumption of normal behaviors, and eventually, curiosity about the world beyond his shared habitat. "He's teaching us about animal grief," Sarah noted in her research journal. "Not as an anthropomorphic projection, but as a genuine emotional process that deserves scientific recognition and respect." 6 months after Atlas's passing, Spirit had established new relationships within the sanctuary, not replacements for his bond with Atlas, but different connections that appeared to provide comfort and companionship. Most notably, he formed an unexpected friendship with an elderly elephant named Maya, who had been rescued from a closing zoo. The two would often stand together in companionable silence, their disparate forms creating a striking silhouette against the sanctuary's landscape. 2 years after the sanctuary's opening, Sarah sat at her desk reviewing applications for the newly established Atlas Spirit Fellowship, a research program supporting graduate students studying interspecies relationships and animal cognition. The stack of applications had grown each year, reflecting the expanding academic interest in the field that their work had helped legitimize. A knock at her office door interrupted her review. Mark entered, looking both excited and slightly apprehensive. "The board approved it," he announced without preamble. "The expansion. Full funding for the next phase, including the new rehabilitation wings and the International Partner Program." Sarah set down the application she'd been reading, a smile spreading across her face. "That's fantastic news. I wasn't sure they'd approve the full proposal, especially the international components." "The documentary series made the difference," Mark replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Viewership numbers for Bonds Beyond Nature have exceeded all projections." The board chair mentioned that donations spike after each episode airs. The documentary series in question had evolved from the initial special about Atlas and Spirit into an ongoing program documenting the various residents of the sanctuary and the scientific discoveries emerging from their observation. It had won several awards and, more importantly, had captured public imagination in a way that traditional nature programming rarely achieved. "Speaking of the series," Mark continued, "the production team wants to do a special episode on Spirit's journey since Atlas passed. They're calling it After Atlas, exploring grief, resilience, and new bonds in animals." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I think that could be valuable, as long as they maintain the scientific integrity we've insisted on. No anthropomorphizing, no manufactured drama. They've agreed to all our conditions," Mark assured her. "They understand that the real story is compelling enough without embellishment," and it truly was. In the year and a half since Atlas's death, Spirit had not only adjusted, but had taken on an unexpected role within the sanctuary. The horse who had been saved by a predator's compassion now seemed to possess a unique ability to calm new arrivals, especially those showing signs of trauma or stress. Sanctuary staff had begun informally referring to him as the Welcome Committee, often bringing anxious newcomers to adjacent enclosures, where Spirit's calm presence seemed to have a settling effect. The scientific papers documenting this phenomenon had initially been met with skepticism. How could a horse possibly understand the needs of species so different from his own? Yet the behavioral data was compelling, showing statistically significant reductions in stress indicators when new residents were given visual access to Spirit, compared to control groups without such exposure. "There's something else," Mark said, his tone shifting to one of greater seriousness. "The team in Kenya has identified another potential case, a cheetah that's been observed repeatedly approaching a specific gazelle without predatory behavior. They've documented multiple instances where the two animals have been in proximity without the expected chase sequence." Sarah leaned forward, instantly intrigued. "That's remarkable. Any theories about what might be happening?" "It's early stages, but their initial observation suggests the gazelle may have been the same one that was present when the cheetah was injured by a poacher's trap last year. There's speculation that some form of recognition might be occurring." This was precisely the kind of case that the Sanctuary's International Partner Program had been designed to support, providing resources, expertise, and potentially rehabilitation options for animals exhibiting unusual interspecies relationships in the wild. With the board's approval of the expansion, they could now offer substantial assistance to conservation teams around the world encountering similar phenomena. As Mark departed to share the good news with the rest of the team, Sarah turned to the large window overlooking the sanctuary grounds. From her office, she could see Spirit's current habitat, where the horse was visible standing near the fence line shared with Maya, the elephant's enclosure. The two dissimilar animals often spent hours in this companionable proximity, sometimes touching trunks and muzzles through the specially designed barrier that allowed safe interaction. Sarah's thoughts drifted to that first extraordinary moment years ago, when she and Mark had witnessed a dying foal and an aging lion defy every natural law to form a connection that would ultimately change countless lives. Not just their own, but those of the sanctuary residents, the research team, and perhaps even the broader understanding of animal consciousness. The scientific papers, the documentaries, the expanded facility, all of these were important legacies of that moment. But as she watched Spirit gently interact with Maya, Sarah knew that the most profound legacy was something less tangible, but infinitely more valuable. A widened perspective on what was possible when boundaries between species, between instinct and choice, between nature and nurture, were transcended by something as simple and as profound as compassion. That evening, as the sanctuary staff gathered for their weekly meeting, Dr. Chen made an unusual announcement. Typically focused exclusively on operational matters and research updates, he instead began by sharing a letter that had arrived that morning. "This comes from a 12-year-old girl in Australia," he explained, unfolding the carefully handwritten pages. She writes, "Before learning about Atlas and Spirit, I thought animals just did what their instincts told them to do. Now I understand they can make choices that don't make sense according to nature rules. This makes me think differently about the choices I make too. If a lion can choose to help instead of hunt, maybe people can make better choices about how we treat each other and animals too." Michael paused, clearly moved by the child's words. "We've received thousands of letters like this, from children and adults, from people who've never had any connection to wildlife conservation before. This is what Atlas and Spirit have given us, not just scientific insights, but a new story about possibility." As the meeting continued with its usual agenda of research updates and operational details, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. From that first desperate encounter on the parched plains to the thriving sanctuary that now stood as testament to interspecies connection, the path had been neither straight nor easy. There had been setbacks, skepticism, and the inevitable heartbreak of Atlas's passing. Yet through it all, the fundamental truth that had been revealed that day remained unchanged. The boundaries between species, between instinct and choice, between what was expected and what was possible, these were not as fixed or impermeable as humans had long believed. In that space of possibility, in that recognition of shared consciousness across different forms, lay hope not just for greater understanding of the animal world, but perhaps for humanity's relationship with all life on Earth. 5 years to the day after the rescue of Atlas and Spirit, the sanctuary hosted a special commemorative event. Unlike the media spectacle of the opening ceremony, this was a quieter gathering. Primarily staff, researchers, and a select group of supporters who had been integral to the sanctuary's development. The centerpiece of the event was the dedication of the new Atlas Memorial Gateway, an artistic entrance to the sanctuary featuring a bronze sculpture of the lion and horse together, based on one of Mark's most iconic photographs. The sculpture, created by a renowned wildlife artist, captured with remarkable emotion the moment when Atlas had first approached the dying foal, their eyes meeting in that extraordinary first connection. As attendees gathered around the sculpture for the unveiling ceremony, Sarah stood slightly apart, experiencing a profound sense of how far they had come. The sanctuary had grown beyond anyone's initial vision, now housing 27 interspecies pairs or groups, and serving as the hub for a global network of similar facilities. The research emerging from their work had fundamentally shifted scientific understanding of animal cognition and emotion, with papers published in the world's most prestigious journals. Dr. Chen delivered a brief but moving dedication speech, after which the guests were invited to tour the sanctuary's newest addition, the Education Center, where interactive displays, carefully curated footage, and engaging exhibits would help visitors of all ages understand the extraordinary relationships being studied and nurtured within the sanctuary. As the official event concluded and guests dispersed to various parts of the facility, Sarah made her way to a particular observation blind, one specifically positioned to view Spirit's habitat. Now 8 years old and in his prime, the horse who had once been a dying foal had become an ambassador, not just for his own story, but for the very concept of transcending boundaries. Inside the blind, Sarah was surprised to find Jessica, who had recently returned from 6 months at their partner sanctuary in India. "I thought I might find you here," the veterinarian said with a smile. "Some habits don't change, do they?" Sarah returned the smile, moving to the viewing window where Spirit was visible grazing peacefully in the distance. "On days like this, I feel drawn to check on him." "Silly, I know." "Not silly at all," Jessica replied. "He's the reason we're all here, the reason any of this exists." They watched in companionable silence as Spirit raised his head, seemingly sensing something beyond human perception. A moment later, a young female elephant appeared at the connecting gateway between habitats. This was Suma, Maya's adopted orphan, now 3 years old and forming her own unique bond with the horse who had befriended her surrogate mother. "Did I tell you about the visitor from last week?" Jessica asked, her eyes still on the interacting animals. "A neuroscientist from Stockholm University. She's proposing a new study using non-invasive imaging to understand what happens in the brain during these cross-species interactions. Says our work here has completely changed how she thinks about evolutionary neurobiology." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. The sanctuary had become a magnet for researchers from disciplines far beyond traditional conservation biology. Neurologists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, even philosophers exploring the nature of consciousness. What had begun as an anomalous observation had grown into something approaching a new field of study. "Oh, before I forget," Jessica continued, reaching into her bag, "this just arrived in this morning's mail. It's from that school in South Africa, the one where we did the video conference last month." She handed Sarah a large envelope, from which Sarah extracted a colorful collection of hand-drawn pictures. Each showed some variation of the Atlas and Spirit story, interpreted through the eyes of children who had never seen a lion or horse in person, yet had been touched by their story from thousands of miles away. "They're creating their own sanctuary," Jessica explained, pointing to the accompanying letter, "a small wildlife rehabilitation area behind their school. It started after our presentation. The teacher says the students were so inspired they convinced the whole community to help." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her throat as she looked through the children's artwork. One drawing in particular caught her eye, a simple but powerful rendition of Atlas offering water to Spirit, with the words, "Kindness has no boundaries," carefully printed beneath it. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Sarah made her way to the sanctuary's highest point, a natural overlook that provided a panoramic view of the entire facility. From this vantage point, she could see multiple habitats, each housing animals whose relationships defied conventional understanding: the wolf and deer who slept side by side, the gorilla who had adopted an injured jungle cat, the pair of traditional rivals, a tiger and a bear, who had formed an alliance in captivity that continued even when given separate spaces. Beyond the sanctuary boundaries stretched the natural landscape of the plains, the same ecosystem where 5 years earlier, an aging predator had made a choice that defied every natural law, a choice to nurture rather than hunt, to protect rather than consume. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded Sarah of Atlas's eyes, those wise, ancient eyes that had somehow seen beyond instinct to possibility. As darkness slowly embraced the sanctuary, lights automatically dimmed to maintain the natural cycles important for the animal's well-being. In that gentle transition from day to night, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The story that had begun with a moment of unlikely compassion had come full circle. The dying foal saved by a predator's kindness had grown into a horse who now offered his own form of healing presence to others. The scientific curiosity sparked by that first observation had blossomed into a body of research, changing how humanity understood animal consciousness. And the sanctuary born from that singular connection now stood as living testimony to what was possible when boundaries were transcended by compassion. As Sarah turned to leave the overlook, her phone chimed with a message from Dr. Chen. New case identified in Brazil. Jaguar and capybara, local team sending footage. Extraordinary preliminary observations. Meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. She smiled as she read the message. The work continued. The boundaries of understanding expanded further with each new discovery. And somewhere in the gathering darkness below, a horse who had once been moments from death now rested peacefully, his extraordinary journey having opened doors of perception and possibility that would continue to ripple outward long after any of them were gone. In that moment, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that while Atlas's physical presence had ended, his legacy, their legacy, would continue to grow, challenging preconceptions and inspiring new understanding of the complex, beautiful connections possible between all living beings. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.